On a grey morning in April 1945, near Fallingbostel in Lower Saxony, a column of defeated German auxiliaries shuffled past gutted brick and the black skeletons of barns. The air tasted of diesel and cordite, and the low sun pressed thin and pallid through a haze of camp smoke. The prisoners, young women pulled from Luftwaffe communications detachments and Red Cross auxiliary units, moved with the mechanical, fearful step of civilians pressed into war's machinery. From an Axis point of view, this procession read like the last, humiliating accounting of a collapsing front. A junior NCO later recorded in a post-war diary how propaganda had taught them to expect hatred rather than small mercies, and that expectation sharpened every footfall. Morning deepened, and the column threaded between collapsed telegraph poles and the rusting hulks of overturned half-tracks. The steady clink of mess tins and the low rumble of supply lorries were the fragile soundtrack to an exhausted people being processed by an advancing army. These women were not frontline infantry, but they were embedded in the machinery of war. Signalers who tended field radios and switchboards, auxiliary nurses who packed dressings, drivers and clerks whose paper trails fed logistics. Their uniforms were threadbare, boots scuffed. Many carried the faint antiseptic smell of makeshift aid posts. The landscape itself held the history of production. Beyond the hedgerows lay factories and airfields whose output had sustained Luftwaffe operations for years, now silent or seized. Late in the morning, as a British supply convoy rerouted down a village lane, a small knot of children detached from a trailing truck and stepped forward. Their palms were full of daisies, stems pinched between grubby fingers, and the simple scent of crushed petals drifted like a foreign thing over the scene. The prisoners stopped. Some smiled in stunned disbelief. Some let tears fall openly. Several later described the sensation as if a taut line of fear had snapped inside them. British soldiers nearby, supply drivers and young infantry, watched unsure whether to call the children away. The tension was not strategic but profoundly human, a tiny, improvised encounter transgressing the binary the war had insisted upon. That stunned silence, the smell of petals and diesel, the innocence of children facing the exhausted auxiliaries, becomes our anchor. It does not rewrite policy or erase violence, but it reveals how private acts of kindness could pierce propaganda and exhaustion at war's end. To understand why daisies could meet auxiliaries on a lane outside Fallingbostel, and why those moments mattered to survivors and witnesses, we now turn to the military routes, civilian displacements, and small pattern interactions that preceded and made possible such encounters. In the neat symmetry of Nazi propaganda, womanhood was both exalted and confined. From 1933 onward, German girls grew up beneath banners that married purity to service, obedience to destiny. In classrooms and village halls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, taught them to braid loyalty as tightly as their hair, to view motherhood and sacrifice as national virtues. Camps in the Black Forest or along the Baltic coast echoed with marching songs about racial pride and duty to the Führer. What began as patriotic ritual hardened, by the late 1930s, into ideological armor, a moral code that equated compassion for the enemy with betrayal of the Reich. By 1941, when the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht expanded their auxiliary ranks, this generation of indoctrinated women was ready to serve, not as fighters, but as the invisible nervous system of the war machine. They tapped out Morse code from bunkers, tracked Allied bombers on plotting tables, and tended the wounded in field hospitals from Lille to Smolensk. Yet even in those dimly lit command posts, the reach of propaganda was constant. Every radio bulletin, every newsreel, every leaflet warned that the Allies would bring vengeance and degradation if they ever set foot on German soil. Posters showed grinning caricatures of British and American troops defiling villages. Hitler youth pamphlets insisted that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. These images lodged deep. Many young auxiliaries, barely out of school, came to believe capture was synonymous with annihilation. Diaries recovered after the war reveal private confessions, lines scrawled in pencil about fear of being taken alive, and orders to destroy codebooks rather than face interrogation. As the Reich's frontiers began to implode in 1944, that fear metastasized. Air raid sirens replaced parades. The confident symmetry of Nazi womanhood gave way to sleepless shifts inside flak towers, where girls barely 20 aimed searchlights at Lancaster bombers above Hamburg or Cologne. To them, the war's end carried no promise of liberation, only judgment. Rumors from the East, especially of Soviet retribution, magnified this dread. Even on the Western Front, Allied kindness seemed inconceivable. In propaganda screenings held as late as March 1945, the enemy was still depicted as a beast in uniform. So when these women finally emerged from bunkers and command posts, faces pale from months of underground confinement, boots muddied from long marches, they were braced for cruelty. What met them instead were soldiers who, though cautious, obeyed strict orders under the Geneva Conventions. Rations were distributed. Medical treatment was offered. Civilians sometimes looked on not with hatred, but with weary pity. To minds steeped in years of dehumanization, such gestures struck with disorienting force. Allied restraint did not merely surprise them. It ruptured the psychological world the regime had built. The moment at Fallingbostel, when children stepped forward with flowers, was thus not an isolated miracle, but the culmination of that internal collapse. The disbelief etched across the faces of those German auxiliaries was the visible consequence of a decade of conditioning meeting its antithesis. And to trace how that reckoning unfolded across a defeated nation, one must now follow the last military convulsions of the Reich, the spring offensives and mass surrenders that swept thousands of women into Allied custody. By the first week of April 1945, the map of Europe had become a mosaic of encirclements and crumbling front lines. The 21st Army Group, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, surged through northern Germany, its armoured divisions pushing across the Weser and toward the Elbe. To the east, the Red Army had sealed Berlin's fate. Between those converging forces lay the wreckage of the Third Reich. Millions of exhausted soldiers, Volkssturm conscripts and auxiliaries, abandoning weapons that no longer had a front to defend. Among them were nearly 500,000 women, once woven into the fabric of the Wehrmacht's support network, typists, radio operators, clerks, drivers and nurses who had served in Luftwaffe or army auxiliary formations. Their surrender marked a quiet but massive social collapse, an empire of uniforms dissolving into columns of displaced humanity. In Schleswig-Holstein and Lower Saxony, the scene was repeated day after day. British and Canadian units of the 21st Army Group established ad hoc reception zones to process these waves of captives. Reports from the 11th Armoured Division describe narrow country roads lined with unarmed women, in field grey or Luftwaffe blue, marching under the watch of equally bewildered non-commissioned officers. For Allied troops hardened by years of combat, the sight was dissonant. The enemy not as a machine of violence, but as rows of frightened clerks and telegraphists clutching their kits. One British corporal later wrote that the women looked less like soldiers than refugees wearing the wrong insignia. Treatment varied with circumstance. In some convoys, soldiers offered water, rations or cigarettes. In others, discipline was maintained at bayonet point, wary of sabotage or hidden weapons. Despite differences in tone, the process followed a mechanical rhythm, registering names, confiscating identification, and segregating personnel by function. Though many of these women had never handled a rifle, their uniforms made them bearers of a vanquished ideology. To the victors, they were symbols of the state that had bombed London and burned Europe. To themselves, they were simply trying to survive its collapse. At Fallingbostel, where prisoner-of-war cages had once held captured British soldiers earlier in the war, the irony was palpable. Now it was German auxiliaries who filled the wire enclosures, waiting for classification under the Geneva Conventions. Nearby, the camp at Lüneburg served as a secondary holding center, where intelligence officers sifted through units, separating true combatants from clerical staff. These compounds became microcosms of the collapsing Reich, order maintained by foreign guards, amid ruins that still smelled of smoke and spring rain. What struck both captors and captives was the landscape itself, a countryside scarred yet serene. British and Canadian towns near the camps were a collage of contradictions, church spires shattered by bomb fragments rising above fields suddenly alive with daisies and the green of April wheat. It was in these half-ruined villages that the first unguarded human encounters occurred. As convoys passed through, children emerged from shelters and cellars, thin, barefoot, curious, sometimes waving. sometimes offering a flower plucked from the roadside. The German women, expecting hatred, froze before these gestures that made no sense in the logic of war. For many, this was their first moment of emotional disarmament. The propaganda of Allied cruelty evaporated not through argument, but through the innocence of a child's wave. British and Canadian guards observed in silence, unsure whether to interpret these exchanges as defiance or grace. Yet the memory endured, the image of surrendering women, boots caked in mud, meeting the eyes of children who had survived the Blitz's cousins across the sea. From these northern German lanes, where fields met ruins and flowers met fear, the narrative widens westward. In France, within the shattered landscapes of Normandy, similar encounters unfolded as German auxiliaries surrendered to British and American forces amid towns reborn from rubble. The next chapter follows that fragile repetition of humanity on the roads of Caen and Bayeux, where the war's moral geometry began to shift once again. By the summer of 1945, the war's front lines had receded into memory, but in northern France the evidence of occupation lingered everywhere. The roads outside Caen and Bayeux wound through landscapes still pocked with shell holes and lined with the skeletal remains of barns. Amid the quiet return of farm life, convoys of German prisoners continued to arrive, columns of women who had served as clerks, cipher operators, and nurses in Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht units. These were the remnants of the Reich's western apparatus, gathered up during the final Allied offensives, and now dispersed among a network of makeshift internment camps stretching from Normandy to Brittany. The first encounters between these women and liberated civilians were tense and often venomous. For the French, whose villages had endured 5 years of occupation, the sight of the German uniform, no matter how threadbare, was a provocation. Early reports from Bayeux in May 1945 describe mobs jeering at prisoner transports and women being pelted with refuse as they passed. Memories of collaboration and betrayal were still raw, and the instinct for vengeance flared easily. Yet as the occupation authorities stabilized, and the French Red Cross, under Allied supervision, assumed control of several internment centers, a new approach emerged. The guiding principle was not retribution, but re-civilization. A deliberate assertion that France, now free, would govern itself by law and humanity rather than revenge. Under the Service des prisonniers et déportés, nurse replaced guards in some compounds, and visiting clergy began organizing moral instruction sessions. Outside Caen, one such camp occupied the grounds of a requisitioned girls' school. Its classrooms converted into infirmaries for sick and wounded German women, including former Luftwaffe cipher operators captured near the Channel coast. It was there in early July 1945 that a quiet yet astonishing moment unfolded. French teachers from a nearby lycée, working with Red Cross volunteers, arranged for local schoolchildren to visit the camp as part of what they called leçons de paix, lessons of peace. Each child carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, poppies, daisies, cornflowers, gathered from fields that only months earlier had been riddled with shrapnel. When the children entered the courtyard, the reaction was electric. The German women, gaunt and wary, stiffened as if under inspection. Many expected humiliation, believing the flowers were bait for mockery. One witness, a Red Cross nurse named Suzanne Lefebvre, later recalled that some backed away as though from a weapon. But as the children stood silently, offering their handfuls of color, the atmosphere shifted. A few prisoners began to cry openly. One interpreter noted how a young telegraphist fell to her knees, pressing the flowers to her face as if testing whether they were real. Others hesitated, trembling, before accepting the bouquets. What the French teachers had intended as a moral lesson became something far deeper, a spontaneous ritual of disarmament, enacted without speeches or flags. For the French civilians who witnessed it, the gesture carried profound symbolism. To accept one's former oppressors as fellow humans was to reclaim the moral ground the occupation had poisoned. To the German women it was incomprehensible. After years of indoctrination warning that the Allies would destroy them, this unexpected mercy fractured their understanding of the world. Several later described that day, not the formal surrender of May 8th, as the true end of the war, the moment the walls of fear finally collapsed. British liaison officers monitoring the camp noted similar reactions in their reports, describing a pervasive quiet and a marked change in behavior among prisoners afterward. The episode at Caen was not unique, but it stands as one of the most documented examples of emotional reconciliation in post-liberation France. It revealed how compassion could operate as a weapon of reconstruction, undoing what years of totalitarian discipline had built. From the ruined villages of Normandy, this fragile thread of humanity extended even farther north, to the coasts of Norway, where another contingent of female German auxiliaries, stranded by capitulation, would encounter a liberated people whose response was equally unexpected and equally transformative. In the final days of May 1945, Northern Europe stood in an uneasy calm. The guns had fallen silent, but the echo of occupation still lingered in the fjords and cities of Norway, where nearly 350,000 German troops surrendered, the last major Wehrmacht contingent to capitulate in Western Europe. For 5 years, Norway had lived under the shadow of German rule, its harbours commandeered, its police infiltrated, its resistance hunted. When the capitulation orders came, the Norwegian people watched their former occupiers file down from garrison posts, disarmed and dazed. Among the surrendering ranks were several thousand women, clerks, typists, and naval communications auxiliaries who had served in Kriegsmarine offices in Oslo, Bergen, and Trondheim. Their presence unsettled many Norwegians. These women had worn the same insignia as the officers who had requisitioned homes, arrested patriots, and enforced racial edicts. Yet after half a decade of fear, the impulse for vengeance was weakened by exhaustion. The first Allied representatives to arrive were British officers of the 1st Airborne Corps, flown in to supervise disarmament and prevent chaos. They issued immediate orders: no reprisals, no humiliation, strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. The disarmament unfolded with remarkable orderliness. German formations stacked rifles in neat pyramids along the quays, saluting for the last time before being marched to holding areas. Female personnel were separated and confined to temporary quarters, harbour warehouses near Akershus fortress in Oslo, where rows of cots stood between crates of munitions and the lingering smell of oil and salt. Their daily routine was minimal: registration, rations, waiting. Outside, the Norwegian flag flew again over public buildings for the first time since 1940, a sight that for many civilians eclipsed the bitterness of the past 5 years. It was within this fraught but strangely subdued atmosphere that an episode occurred which mirrored, almost perfectly, the one that had taken place weeks earlier in Normandy. In mid-June, teachers from a local Oslo school, seeking to guide their students toward peace rather than hatred, organized a symbolic act of reconciliation. A small group of children, dressed in patched coats and wooden clogs, walked to the harbour encampment, carrying wildflowers gathered from the hills above the city. The idea, later described in the pages of Aftenposten, was simple: to let the nation's youngest citizens extend the first gesture of peace to those who had once ruled them. When the children appeared at the gates, guards hesitated. The German women inside, still expecting hostility, pressed against the wire, unsure what they were seeing. Then one of the teachers motioned the children forward. They passed the blooms, violets, dandelions, mountain daisies, through the fence. For a long moment no one moved. Witnesses described a stunned quiet that seemed to swallow the harbour noise. Then one prisoner, a young Navy telegraphist from Bremen, began to cry. Others followed. A British officer on duty later noted in his report that discipline was maintained, but emotion overcame formality. To the Norwegian teachers, this was a lesson in moral strength, a declaration that their nation, though scarred, would rebuild itself through dignity rather than vengeance. To the German women, the gesture struck far deeper. For years they had been told that defeat meant degradation, that conquered peoples would seek blood. Instead, they were confronted with gentleness. That inversion of expectation, the discovery that compassion could wound more profoundly than punishment, left many of them visibly shaken. Some refused to accept the flowers at first, believing it a cruel test. Others clutched them tightly, as if holding proof that the world still contained forgiveness. British liaison officers recorded an immediate transformation in camp behaviour. After the incident, one wrote, order became voluntary. The prisoners cleaned their quarters, shared rations more evenly, and ceased complaints. What had been an occupation concluded not with retribution, but with a quiet experiment in empathy. Norwegian officials would later cite the episode in policy. Papers on post-war reorientation, a preview of the broader re-education efforts soon to take shape across Europe. From the cold light of Oslo's harbour, where kindness became a form of instruction, the story now crosses the Atlantic, to the American zone of occupation, and to the vast POW camps of the United States. There, far from the ruins of Europe, thousands of captured German soldiers and auxiliaries would encounter yet another paradox, the discovery that life among their former enemies could sometimes feel more humane than it had under their own flag. Across the Atlantic, the war's human debris arrived in silence. By the summer of 1945, troop ships that had once ferried divisions to Europe now carried a very different cargo: German prisoners of war bound for temporary detention in the United States. Among the vast ranks of captured soldiers, nearly 370,000 men, was a much smaller, largely forgotten group, several hundred female auxiliaries, most drawn from Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht administrative corps. Their transport to America was not punitive, but procedural, part of the Allied effort to catalogue, interrogate, and ultimately repatriate non-combat personnel under controlled conditions. To these women, however, the journey felt like exile beyond comprehension. They had been told the Allies would enslave or execute them. Instead, they found themselves crossing the ocean under Red Cross supervision. Their fear amplified by every unfamiliar horizon. The ships docked at ports from New York to Norfolk, where the prisoners were sorted and dispatched to camps in Texas, Iowa, Maryland, and Massachusetts. The War Department, adhering to the Geneva Conventions, placed female prisoners in segregated compounds adjacent to larger male enclosures. Conditions were Spartan but orderly. Barracks with cots and blankets, scheduled meals, medical checks, and morning roll calls conducted by U.S. Army military police. Yet what struck the newcomers most was the normality of it all. The guards were disciplined, even polite. The food, canned fruit, coffee, white bread, seemed almost indecently abundant after the hunger of wartime Germany. One prisoner later wrote, "We thought it was a trick, a kind of moral experiment. No one could believe that our enemy would feed us so well." Nowhere was this paradox more acute than at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where a small contingent of female auxiliaries was temporarily quartered in the spring of 1946. The New England winter had barely lifted when a local church group approached camp officials with an unusual proposal: a Good Friday visit from neighborhood children, intended as an act of reconciliation before Easter. The idea was cautiously approved. On a cool April morning, a group of boys and girls dressed in Sunday clothes and carrying small bouquets of daffodils and crocuses were escorted through the gates. They sang hymns in halting German-accented English, "Nearer, my God, to thee, and abide with me." The women lined up behind the wire stood rigid at first, unable to meet their eyes. Then, as the children stepped forward to hand them flowers through the fence, composure collapsed. A former Luftwaffe communications clerk named Lieselotte H., who would later emigrate to Canada, recalled the moment in her memoir. "A little girl held out a yellow flower. I wanted to refuse it. I felt unworthy to exist. But she smiled as if she had forgiven everything I had done, even what I had not done. I took the daffodil, and the war finally ended for me." That single gesture, a child's innocence confronting an adult's guilt, captured the profound contradiction of the POW experience in America. For the guards and visiting civilians, it confirmed the moral righteousness of the Allied cause, a living proof that justice could coexist with mercy. For the German women, it forced an inward reckoning that no interrogation could achieve. Psychologists attached to the War Department's Prisoner of War Division later cited these experiences in early denazification studies, noting that sustained exposure to humane treatment produced more ideological disintegration than coercion. The camps thus became laboratories of reorientation, demonstrating that the collapse of Nazism required not only victory in battle, but the re-education of conscience. Many of the women repatriated later in 1946 carried home diaries describing America not as a place of punishment, but as a mirror in which their moral illusions dissolved, as the last POW ships departed and the war's physical infrastructure, camps, depots and supply lines was dismantled. The real work of reconstruction began. The story now turns to that invisible machinery, the Allied policies and moral philosophies that allowed compassion to exist within conquest, shaping the post-war order that would define Europe's uneasy peace. Behind the tenderness of those small encounters lay a calculated architecture of moral purpose. By late 1944, as the tide of war shifted decisively toward Allied victory, leaders in London and Washington began to view peace not merely as the cessation of combat, but as a contest for the conscience of Europe. The lessons of 1918 loomed large. Military triumph alone had not secured stability, and humiliation had seeded future conflict. Thus, when planning for the occupation of Germany, Allied policymakers resolved that the post-war order must rest on ethical legitimacy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided the legal skeleton, its clauses guaranteeing humane treatment, sufficient food and freedom from collective punishment. But the flesh of that ideal came from deliberate human conduct. Generals, such as Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery, understood that discipline in victory was itself a form of propaganda. In field memoranda circulated among the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division and the British War Office, officers were instructed that the behavior of Allied troops towards surrendered enemies would become the first chapter of post-war history. Memos emphasized restraint, civility, and, crucially, visible fairness toward women and civilians. Every loaf of bread shared, every wound tended, one British directive declared, is an argument against the lies of fascism. To soldiers who had endured years of combat, such idealism was often difficult to sustain. Yet the system held because it was framed as strategic virtue, not sentiment. In practice, this doctrine extended beyond the battlefield into classrooms, churches, and occupied towns. Across liberated France, the Ministry of Education encouraged symbolic gestures of forgiveness, often using children as ambassadors of reconciliation. Teachers in Caen Bayou and later Oslo were explicitly supported by UNRWA and Red Cross officials, who viewed these acts as small laboratories of social rehabilitation. What appeared spontaneous, the offering of flowers, the singing of hymns, was in fact guided by policy, the translation of moral intention into civic ritual. The Allies had recognized something subtle yet profound, that compassion, when displayed with consistency, could dismantle enemy propaganda more effectively than any leaflet drop or loudspeaker broadcast. Axis intelligence analysts later acknowledged this with discomfort. Surviving Wehrmacht morale reports from 1945 note the psychological disintegration among prisoners exposed to humane treatment. One captured officer described it as a moral offensive, a campaign in which food, fairness, and discipline eroded ideological armor more efficiently than fear. Propaganda loses its power, he wrote, when the enemy behaves better than one's own leaders promised he would. For female German auxiliaries, this inversion struck hardest. Years of indoctrination had taught them to expect degradation. Instead, they met courtesy and structure. The result was a crisis not only of loyalty, but of identity. The enemy they had been taught to hate had behaved honorably, while the regime that had claimed moral superiority lay in ashes. This internal collapse, experienced quietly in barracks, camps, and hospital wards, was as decisive as any defeat on the field. It marked the transition from surrender to transformation, from the end of war to the beginning of moral reconstruction. As Allied policy evolved into occupation governance, the focus shifted from prisoners of war to the millions of displaced civilians now wandering a shattered Germany. Widows, refugees, and former auxiliaries still haunted by the myths they had lived under. There, in the ruins of their own homeland, the grand experiment in ethical victory would face its greatest test. By late 1945, the Third Reich had ceased to exist, but its ghosts lingered in every collapsed wall and empty pantry. Across Germany, the landscape resembled a lunar plain. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and hundreds of smaller towns reduced to skeletons of brick and ash. Millions were homeless. Hunger and disease replaced artillery as daily threats. Yet amid this desolation, the victorious Allies began an undertaking unlike any in modern history, the moral reconstruction of a nation. The program would come to be known simply as re-education. What began as a practical necessity, occupying and administering a defeated country, soon evolved into an audacious social experiment. Allied planners concluded that true peace required not only the dismantling of the Nazi state, but the reshaping of German thought itself. Within this effort, female POWs and former auxiliaries became unexpected participants and symbols. Many had served in clerical, communications, or propaganda roles, extensions of the machinery that had sustained Hitler's rule. Now stripped of uniforms and authority, they found themselves sitting at wooden desks, under the supervision of the very nations they had been trained to despise. In the British zone of occupation, the Control Commission for Germany spearheaded these rehabilitation initiatives. Temporary classrooms were established in repurposed barracks and schools, where lessons in democracy, civic ethics, and international cooperation replaced wartime indoctrination. Lecturers, often British officers' wives or Quaker volunteers, guided discussions on tolerance, rule of law, and personal responsibility. To reinforce theory with lived experience, local children were brought into the camps for shared projects, planting vegetables, tending flowers, or drawing together under supervision. These carefully staged encounters were intended to humanize both sides, dissolving the ideological poison of master race and enemy alien. One recurring motif was the exchange of flowers. The symbolism was simple yet potent, life replacing death, innocence confronting guilt. Reports from British social welfare officers describe women breaking down upon receiving small bouquets from children who had themselves survived bombing raids. It felt like forgiveness embodied. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary later wrote in her journal, "We were the guilty ones, yet they gave beauty into our hands." The gesture was both a comfort and a torment, comfort in its kindness, torment in the mirror it held up to their conscience. To Allied administrators, these moments confirmed the theory that empathy could be retaught. They believed that exposure to compassion, rather than punitive discipline, might erode resentment and lay the groundwork for democratic renewal. But beneath the surface, the emotional terrain was volatile. Many German women oscillated between shame and defiance, gratitude and humiliation. Some perceived the programs as moral colonization, an attempt to overwrite identity. Others, exhausted by loss, embraced the lessons as a path back to normalcy. The experiment's success could not be measured in numbers or attendance sheets, but in subtler transformations. Diary entries, softened tones, changed expressions. A British welfare officer in Hanover recorded, "We did not teach democracy. We watched it being born in the pause between tears." In this fragile space, half schoolroom, half confessional, the first seeds of a different Germany took root. From these quiet classrooms and flower gardens, the story now turns inward, to the minds of the women themselves. How did they reconcile the collapse of everything they had believed with the unexpected mercy of their conquerors? The next chapter delves into that psychological transformation, how kindness, offered without demand, became both punishment and redemption. By 1946, the guns were silent, but the real battle for memory and meaning had just begun. Allied psychological units, now embedded within occupation commands, turned their attention from interrogations to understanding the minds of the defeated. Among the hundreds of thousands of POWs still held in Europe, the most intriguing cases were not those marked by fanaticism or violence, but by confusion, especially among female auxiliaries. Their reactions, meticulously logged by British and American military psychologists, followed an eerily consistent pattern: disbelief, guilt, then gratitude. The women had expected cruelty and degradation. Instead, they found cleanliness, food, and, most bewildering, human decency. This inversion of expectation, the analysts noted, produced emotional collapse far more effectively than punishment ever could. It was not the chains that broke them, one report observed, but the flowers. A British intelligence officer coined a phrase for the phenomenon, the shock of compassion. It described the psychic rupture that occurred when years of ideological conditioning collided with undeniable evidence of mercy. Acts as simple as a smile from a guard or a child's gift of wildflowers destabilized entire belief systems. Allied observers recorded frequent crying fits, voluntary confessions, and even spontaneous requests from former Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht auxiliaries to serve in Allied-run hospitals or orphanages. "We must pay back what we took," wrote one woman in a letter later seized by censors. Another confessed, "The children healed me. The flowers were heavier than chains." These emotional reversals marked the earliest phase of what Germans would later call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally, coming to terms with the past. For many women, the process began not in classrooms or tribunals, but in the quiet shock of kindness that their worldview could not contain. The Allies, often unconsciously, had achieved a form of psychological disarmament long before formal denazification policies were implemented. Their strategy worked not through coercion, but through contradiction. Mercy where hate was expected, order where chaos was predicted. Still, not all accepted this transformation. Some prisoners, especially those from hardline Nazi Party organizations, dismissed these gestures as a humiliation masked as mercy, a clever form of moral domination. They saw in Allied civility not compassion but condescension, a way to assert superiority, while denying Germans the dignity of resistance. Yet even this resentment betrayed an underlying truth. The balance of moral power had shifted irrevocably. For the majority, the experience left permanent marks. In post-war interviews, women described living with two memories, the rubble of their cities and the faces of children who had forgiven them before they forgave themselves. These memories traveled with them into reconstruction, motherhood, and the slow rebuilding of civil life. They became, in effect, living symbols of disarmed hatred, carriers of an uneasy peace between past and future. From these fractured psyches emerged a new moral landscape, one where defeat was measured not in territory or treaties, but in the collapse of the ideology that had once promised destiny. The next chapter turns to that fragile rebirth, how these women, now civilians again, helped shape West Germany's early identity, haunted, humbled, and quietly remade by the memory of compassion. When the first trains of repatriated prisoners crossed back into Germany in 1946, the country they entered seemed almost foreign. Ruined skylines, burned-out factories, and cities divided among the victors greeted those who had once served the Reich. For the thousands of female auxiliaries returning from Allied custody, the shock of physical destruction was matched by a deeper unease, the awareness that their inner world no longer fit the one around them. They had left a nation built on conviction and fear. They returned to one surviving on endurance and silence. In diaries recovered from the British and American zones, these women described returning to ashes and absence. Yet amid that desolation, they also carried something fragile, the moral residue of captivity, memories of kindness from enemies who had offered them flowers instead of fists. Some sought to preserve that lesson through service. Former Red Cross volunteers joined post-war relief organizations, nursing children orphaned by bombing raids or aiding displaced families. Others became teachers, adopting Allied educational methods that emphasized empathy, civics, and individual conscience over obedience. "We learned democracy through decency," wrote one woman who had been held in Norway, "and we passed it on to our pupils without naming it." Still, not all could bear the weight of remembrance. Many avoided speaking of their captivity altogether, trapped between guilt and gratitude. Sociological surveys from the British zone in 1947 recorded a striking generational divide. Older Germans viewed Allied compassion with distrust, the velvet glove of victors, as one respondent called it, while younger citizens saw it as the first credible model for moral renewal. The narrative of mercy, rarely spoken aloud, began to flow quietly through Germany's cultural recovery. In poetry, paintings, and early post-war films, the image of the innocent child confronting the defeated adult recurred, symbols of conscience transcending ideology. This undercurrent of remembered grace slowly seeped into the broader currents of European reconstruction. What had begun as spontaneous gestures by Allied children or Red Cross teachers evolved into the philosophical foundation of reconciliation. The Council of Europe's founding ideals, cooperation, dignity, mutual forgiveness, owed much to these microcosms of human decency played out in fields, camps, and classrooms. For the women who had once lived through that contradiction, Rebuilding became both a social duty and a personal penance. Thus, the emotional echoes of captivity extended far beyond Germany's ruins. From individual healing grew the first moral architecture of post-war Europe, proof that even amid devastation, compassion could become a strategy of reconstruction. The next section broadens that view, tracing how these intimate acts of mercy helped shape the strategic and political framework of Europe's recovery, culminating in the vision of a continent rebuilt, not by dominance but by conscience. By the early 1950s, the map of Europe had been redrawn, its economies revived, and its people cautiously rebuilding lives from the dust of war. Yet beneath the steel and cement of reconstruction lay something less visible and more enduring. The moral foundation laid years earlier in the quiet gestures of compassion between enemies. Allied occupation authorities began to recognize that re-education through humanity had accomplished what punishment and propaganda could not. Reports circulated through the British Control Commission and US military government described an unexpected outcome. Women once steeped in the rhetoric of Nazi obedience were now organizing local councils, teaching in democratic schools, and volunteering in community rebuilding efforts. When asked why, many traced their transformation not to ideology or policy, but to a single image, a child offering flowers to a prisoner. These recollections appeared repeatedly in post-war interviews and occupation surveys. "It was not the Marshall Plan that first rebuilt us," wrote one former Luftwaffe clerk, "but the small hands that taught us forgiveness." The Allies themselves came to similar conclusions. Military sociologists advising the Office of Military Government, US Zone, OMGES, observed that emotional rehabilitation, not coercion, had been the decisive factor in stabilizing post-war Germany. By demonstrating restraint and compassion, the Western Allies had not only neutralized a defeated enemy, they had cultivated future partners in democracy. This transformation subtly informed emerging Cold War policy. As the Marshall Plan poured billions into Western Europe, its architects understood that material aid would succeed only where moral confidence already existed. That foundation had been laid years earlier, in camp gardens, schoolyards, and along dusty roads like Fallingbostel and Caen, where the first gestures of mercy had replaced the last echoes of hate. Allied analysts cited these encounters as early evidence that reconciliation could serve as a geopolitical instrument, a lesson that would later crystallize in the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, in 1951. Its founding principle, peace through cooperation, was, in essence, an institutional echo of those wartime moments when compassion bridged enmity. The story that began with flowers and tears had grown into the architecture of modern Europe. The women who once stood trembling before Allied children became the first participants in a continental experiment built not on vengeance, but on conscience. Their psychological surrender had become Europe's moral rebirth. And so, as the documentary returns to its opening image, the roadside near Fallingbostel, the spring air heavy with smoke and silence, it reminds us that the true end of the war did not come with signatures or surrenders. It came in a fleeting instant when fear met innocence and defeat gave way to forgiveness. In that moment, the long peace of post-war Europe quietly began, 101 words. The story closes where it began, on that broken road near Fallingbostel, where a column of defeated women paused before a group of British children holding wildflowers. Their faces, once hardened by discipline and propaganda, softened into disbelief and grief. In that single moment, the moral balance of the war shifted. The conquerors, by choosing compassion over vengeance, demonstrated a strength that no army could measure. Across the ruins of France, the fjords of Norway, and even the camps of America, such moments repeated quietly, rarely photographed, yet carried in the memories of those who saw them. They revealed that the truest victory of 1945 was not territorial but human. The rediscovery of empathy after years of annihilation. The flowers the children offered were more than a gesture of peace. They were a rejection of the brutality that had defined the age. For the captured women, they became symbols of a painful rebirth, a reminder that forgiveness could pierce deeper than any wound of war. And for history, they endure as fragile proof that compassion, when shown at the edge of despair, holds the power to rebuild what hatred destroys. The film ends with one enduring question. When the guns fall silent, who truly wins? The soldiers who stop fighting, or the children who learn to forgive?